All right. Welcome again.
Thank you, Sebastian. Hello, hola, I'm Renee or Renee. Either is fine. I'm so honored to be here. I'm such a big fan of Urban Gouda, what their work is, their offerings and their programming. I'm always curious about classes that they offer, and the ones I've taken in the past have been really nourishing and special. So thank you, Sebastian, for holding space for Urban Cura and for hosting us here today. Um, yeah, I would love to, I can introduce myself and then I'd love to hear from y'all since we are a small group. It's always nice to hear different voices during classes and not just my own. So I'll start us off, and if you would like to, I'd welcome you to unmute and introduce yourself. And if you're more comfortable using the chat, that's totally fine too. So my name is Renee. I am speaking to you from Winneman-Wintu land and Shasta land here in Mount Shasta, California, which is far northern California. I was just telling Sebastian, we're an hour south of the so-called Oregon border, and we're very central. As the crow flies, we're not very far from the ocean, but because of all the mountains and the geography, it takes at least 5 hours to reach the coast from where I'm at. So I'm really nestled here next to Boyambuyuk, which is the Winneman-Wintu name for Mount Shasta, which is a volcano, and surrounded by lots of lakes and rivers. And I feel really honored to be on this land because my people on both sides, both of my mom and my dad, come from Nicaragua, which is also land of lakes and volcanoes. Nicaragua has there's agua in the name, and it has a lot of volcanoes. And so although we don't get snow in Nicaragua and we do here, it feels like a similar place to where I grew up going in the summers and where my parents come from. Let's see, I'm a clinical herbalist. So I've been in practice since 2016. I'm a teacher, I'm a mom, and I'm here today really to talk about my own experiences with fire season and to offer ideas for plans and practices to support you and your loved ones during this growing season. It's growing, it's much longer than it used to be. And I think one of the ways that it can impact us is, or one of the reasons why it is the way it is today is because of disconnection and colonization and a lot of things that we'll get into in a little bit here. But I think when we are able to bridge connection and come together in community and support each other and share our knowledge about how we can support ourselves and the more than human beings through these seasons, then that can help heal the disbalance, the disconnection that is keeping these kinds of things in place. So I'll get into a little bit more about what I mean by all that in a moment here. But I wanted to, I would love to hear from y'all if you feel open to unmuting. What brings you here today? Your pronouns, if they're not in your name. I use she, ella. And where your people come from, anything else you feel like sharing. So I will, I will see if anyone is open to unmuting.
Also, if anyone wants to share but not be on the recording, I can pause it. So just let me know.
I can go. I can introduce myself. It's good to see you all. My name is Serena. I use she and they pronouns. And it's interesting, this question. A lot of what you were sharing, Sebastian, was resonating because my people are the Chumash of this. I'm coming to you from Long Beach, California. So this is Tongva land, but my people are Chumash people, and also my dad is from Mexico. So I haven't lived here in about 15 years. So I was actually in the Hudson Valley for many years farming and working with youth and doing food justice work. So it's an interesting, like, coming home to a different type of fire season. So it feels really like almost like urgent without being really overwhelmed by it, but to just be thinking about ways that we're taking care of each other. And this workshop was actually gifted to me by a couple of friends. So, and I like get the newsletters and was really excited to see it, but then I got this little like, hey, we got this for you. So it feels like, oh yeah, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you, for your knowledge and energy. And my relationship to fire is, I think I'm looking to have a little bit more of like a kinship understanding, and just like openness. So I'll pass to whoever would like to go next.
Thank you, Serena.
I can go next. Hello, I'm Kaisa. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today to talk about fire on many levels. I am here on Tewa land, so-called Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the southwest portion of Turtle Island, and I am a aspiring herbalist, community herbalist, and am blessed to be in community with a dear friend of mine who is organizing in a community called Chimayo, just north of where I am, where I'm living, and we are collaborating to reconnect. Well, the community is heavily impacted by opioid addiction, and so we are working to bring bring community together to remember who we are through plants and through the land. And we hold community medicine making days once a month. And right now we're heavily impacted by fire season in that fire has been suppressed here for so long, and with the impacts of capitalism and colonialism, you know, our climate is so dry right now. Our forests are so dry. We don't feel comfortable, foraging or wild harvesting anything right now, because the trees, everyone are under so much stress. And so a lot of people have resorted, well, the land managers have resorted to controlled burns, and those have led to some tremendous destruction and devastation. We have 20 out of control fires burning right now all around, and it's devastating. Hundreds of people have been evacuated, their animals, their traditional ways of life completely disrupted, possibly forever, by these fires. I think it's almost 300,000 acres at this point that are burning out of control. We wake up some mornings with where we can't see the sun because of the smoke, and we're all very traumatized right now, and dealing with the physical impacts of these fires and the smoke. And so I'm so thrilled to be here today to connect with all of you and to learn with you, and to take some of this to our community, to be able to support our community right now with the plants. Just look forward to being able to carry forward what we share today. And otherwise, my relationship to fire is, I very much identify with fire. I'm a fire sign, I'm a Leo, and I know I'm home when I'm sitting around fire with my people. And it's when I know I'm home, no matter where I am. And I honor fire and its power to give life and its power to kill us. So thank you.
Thank you, Kaisa. Thank you for sharing a part of your story. And we have a couple people in the chat. Gati says, same here, grew up Great Lakes, Potawatomi, Ojibwa land. So not familiar with fire relation to prairie communities ecosystem. Now on Kumeyaay lands, very eager to learn more. And Holly says, here I'm from Buffalo, New York. I have no experience with fire season, looking forward to learning today. So welcome everyone. Yeah, and in answer to Sebastian's question, I'll get into my relationship to fire season in a moment, but the ways that fire feels present in my life, I really think of one of the aspects of fire that stands out to me is how humans have come together around fire to tell stories. And that's something that has been happening since people came to be. And so it is with that storytelling energy that I offer you anything that I have to share in my experiences with fire seasons or my experiences working clinically with clients and with plants to support us coming into balance, which is something we all deserve. And so before we move into more of that storytelling, I would love to start us off with a grounding and an intention setting. In this way, we can enter this space together and we can close out the intention at the end of the class. And so I invite you to participate in any way that feels comfortable for you. You're welcome to turn off your camera if that feels good. Excuse me, my son has a cold and I have some phlegm. Okay, so I'm going to do this alongside with you. So make yourselves comfortable and close or lower your eyes. Tune into your breath. Taking a few intentional breaths to invite your spirit to arrive in this moment. And as you continue to breathe with intention, I invite you to call in the elements as a way to ground. We're going to begin with the air element, noticing the sensation of our breath in our bodies. Notice the stories that we tell ourselves as we breathe, the way the mind responds to breath. Notice the way your body responds to your breath. Notice which parts of your body contract, which parts release. Notice the environment that you're in as you breathe. What you're breathing in, what you're exhaling. See if you can breathe into other places in your body. Breathe into your heart. Breathe into your pelvic region. Notice the parts of you that feel more permeable as you breathe. Moving on to the element of water. Notice how the waters in your body respond to your breath. Notice where you feel more movement, perhaps water like a rushing river. Or where you feel more stillness within, like water of a lake. Notice where you feel more dryness within. Explore the ways that the waters within are connected, where you feel flow. Invite your mind to lead with curiosity as you explore your inner landscape, moving around any blocks, observing any criticism. And moving on to that element of fire. Noticing where you feel more heat within. Noticing where your pilot light is lit this morning, this afternoon. Noticing where your passion lies. Holding space for the sorrow. Exploring where you may feel more cool or cold. And finally calling in that earth energy. Letting yourself be held by gravity, softening into that warmth, surrendering to be held by the earth, releasing any tension that's ready to be let go in this moment. Feeling that draw towards the earth. And as you explore that pull, that draw, that brings us home down to earth, notice what you feel grounded in this moment. And with all the information that you're gathering by way of the elements, with all that your body is communicating to you, I invite you to set an intention for this workshop today. An intention for your health and healing, an intention for your community, an intention for your orientation towards fire or towards fire season. And as you arrive at that intention, I also invite you to breathe life into that intention. Help it to come alive. And when you're ready, let yourself stir, stretch, or touch your body. Invite that relationship with your body to guide you into our shared space, and open or raise your eyes when you're ready. Thank you. Thank you for grounding with me. I always find it helpful to ground before exploring intimate subjects that can be potentially triggering or that we have a lot of emotions around. And fire season tends to be something that can be very emotional. So to speak a little bit towards my background with fire season before we move into some of the plants. So I grew up in San Francisco on Ramaytush Ohlone and Muwekma land. We didn't have fire season growing up then. I'm 36, so growing up, it wasn't something that we really experienced. But about 7 years ago, I moved to where I am now in Mount Shasta, and I very quickly learned that there was a season between summer and fall that everyone called fire season, and that it was something that you needed to prepare for. So that's something I've been navigating with since living up here in more rural areas. At the beginning of the pandemic, my family and I temporarily relocated to Talent, Oregon for a year to save money, and we had some financial or some housing instability. So I moved into an apartment in Talent. So I was actually in Talent, Oregon during the fires there. And we were, the fire came to about a block and a half from my house and we were evacuated. And it was my first evacuation. I have a lot of friends that have evacuated, but it was my first time experiencing it firsthand. And so it was the first time I had to put into practice all of these things that I've known I need to prepare for, that I, prepared for figuratively. But I learned a lot from that experience. We didn't get informed by the city of Talent that we needed to go. They didn't do a very good job informing anyone they needed to go. And so my partner happened to look outside and saw the flames and came back very calmly and was like, we need to pack bags and we need to get in the car and we need to go. And he didn't tell me how close the fire was, I think mainly because he knew that I would panic and I wouldn't be as clear-minded in packing. But we had, we were blessed in that we had like 20 minutes to get out. And so we did, and then got into a very long queue of cars trying to leave a very narrow rural valley. And it took us hours, but somehow our apartment didn't burn. Mostly what burned in that fire was the Latinx community, their homes along my homes, I'm a part of that community, but the homes that burned were the ones along the 5, which are mostly villages of 4-wheels and trailers and things like that. And in some ways, there's the belief that that was what was allowed to burn because it was less valued than other places. And so, when teams come in to direct the fire away from things or towards things, that's what inevitably happens for communities that have less access to power. So that experience taught me a lot about how to more immediately prepare for fire season. As we've heard in some of the introductions, it can be a really intense, oppressive time. It can be especially challenging for folks who have past experiences with fire season, for small children, for babies, for the elderly, for anyone with any chronic conditions, especially like respiratory or heart conditions. And it can bring up a lot of feelings of loss and grief. And that, when we're in those states of trauma, it can be really hard for us to take good care of ourselves. And so preparing beforehand for active fire can prevent trauma from hardening in the body, which would then lead to further pain or imbalance tomorrow or in a few years, or even to our future ancestors and, children and grandchildren. So doing our best to prepare is going to be one of the best tools that we have. And so today, the way that we're going to work through the next couple hours together is to spend some time contextualizing fire season, just so we have a better idea of why we're in the place that we're at now with it. And then we're going to move into preventative measures. So energetic practices, plants that we can start working with now to help build resilience within our bodies when fire season becomes more active, if we have that time. And if you're already in acute fire season, as some of you are, we'll move into that last, and we'll go into more of the plants that can benefit from use, from being in relationship with during those moments of active fire. And all throughout, I'm going to have a couple journaling prompts so that we can use this space to prepare together. A lot of preparation just is time, right? Taking the time to reflect on what is of value for us to take with us. One of the things that I regretted was I was able to take a lot of my ceremonial things, which they're kind of irreplaceable items, but I didn't take any of my client files. And I had really deep regret when I was gone. I was really worried because I have a lot of things on my computer, but I have a lot of handwritten notes. And so what I've done since then is I moved all of my client files from like a metal filing cabinet into this like plastic, I can show y'all, it's like I'm looking at it right here, this plastic container that has a handle. And so now when it's an active season, I can very quickly just grab the handle and put it in the car. And so like little things like that, you know, it's little adjustments like that that we have to make, that just the reality of living, you know, 3 or 4 months when we might be evacuated at any moment. And so moving into, let me just check the chat here. Oh, yeah, the grounding. Moving into a little bit of the backstory. And so we can't talk about backstory of fire season without talking about colonization, because we can't talk about the backstory of fire season without talking about the indigenous peoples of this land of Turtle Island, where we're at. And so there's a couple resources that I will share as we move through this story that are helpful if you want to learn more about that relationship. But I'll share a little bit briefly about what I've learned in doing that research. I have, my people are indigenous and European, but of Central America. And so I am a guest, an uninvited guest here in Turtle Island. And so I do my best to respect that relationship and be mindful of what that means in terms of like how I can navigate going forward. And so with that in mind, like looking at that relationship, when Native Americans were the primary tenders of this land, cultural burns were not only intentional for fire management, but also necessary to germinate certain native seeds stored in the soil. And so since we're talking mostly about plants today and we're talking about herbs for fire season, it's important to talk about the relationship between plants and fire. Cultural burns reduce the fuel load that could be burned by naturally occurring wildfires. So not only were cultural burns, and there are places now that are enacting parts of this, like where I live, they're really working with the Winnemem Wintu. The county of Siskiyou County, where I live, is working more closely in the last couple of years with the local tribes to build more of these relationships. So I encourage y'all in your communities to also encourage those types of relationships. But these cultural bones like not only reduce the fuel load that could be burned by naturally occurring wildfires, they also support the diversity of the plant world. So I think oftentimes when we think of like wildfires, we think devastation, we think loss, we think like death, right, of plants, of people, of animals. But a lot of the times there are plants that can only survive through fire. In the Bay Area where I grew up, there's rare species of Ceanothus, which is like and as well as manzanita. These are sometimes called red root in the herb world, that are fire dependent. There's also plants like Burua scandalinea that only live dormant for like 80 plus years, that only are able to germinate with fire. And so it's a testament to that evolutionary relationship between certain plants and fire. And I think finding ways to reorient ourselves towards like the life-giving that fire can offer can be a really beautiful way to move through some of the devastation. There is obviously devastation, which we'll talk about as well, but there is so much life that can happen in fire if it's done in ways that are in more alignment with the communities. And I'm a big believer in the land back movement. And I think for that to happen, power needs to go back into the original tenders of this land in all places. And so encouraging that as much as possible. In terms of like why wildfires have gotten worse lately in the last few years, there's a really great TED talk by this guy, Paul Hesburgh, that's like really breaks it down. I'll put that in the chat. And where he talks about the history of when we switched from fire management to fire suppression. So he talks about how in 1910, there was this huge wildfire out here in the West where I'm living. And the fire was like the size of the state of Connecticut. It was huge and they called it the Big Burn. In a few days, it burned like 3 million acres and destroyed several towns. And it killed like 90 people, not to mention all the plant animal that animal people that lost their lives. And so because of that one big burn, wildfires became the enemy. And so the Forest Service, which is an organization that at the time in 1910 had only been around for like a few years, they were put responsible of putting out all wildfires on like 100 or 200 million acres of public land. And they were successful at that mission. They were able to put out like 95 to 98% of all fires every single year in so-called United States. And so what was sustainable fire management became fire suppression. And so in that, fire became the enemy. Like fire was no longer this necessary element to be in relationship with that helps germinate plants, that helps make soil more fertile, that helps manage regular, because wildfires is a naturally occurring thing. Because of the suppression, we started getting these things called megafires, which is where we're at today. These are like, it's estimated that where I live, it's going to take another like 8 years for like everything to burn before we get to a place where we're not like in this like extreme threat. So like I'm setting myself up for like a decade of dealing with fire in this extreme way, whereas it could have in the past been, well, due to colonization, it's been folks that were in charge didn't really know what they were doing. So fire became the enemy. There's also this really fantastic, I can like hear my son. I don't know if you guys can hear him. He's 4. He's being pretty funny. But let me know if you can't hear me and I can go tell him to calm down. It's Sunday and I think that he's like making voices. Anyway, there's this really great documentary season called Tending the Wild. If you haven't seen it, I'm pretty sure you can still watch the whole thing for free online. I think it's through PBS. I'll put it in the chat, Tending the Wild. But it's different indigenous perspectives on tending the wild. And one of the episodes of the series is about fires. And it's an environmental knowledge of indigenous peoples in so-called California. And so at one point during the series, Ron Good, who's of the North Folk Mono tribe, talks about how fire is always about water. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start with that elemental grounding in the morning or at the beginning of our workshop, because yes, we're here to talk about fire, but you can't really talk about fire without talking about all the other elements. They're in relationship with each other. And that's a part of, like when we start moving through body systems and talking about plants to support us physically and emotionally and spiritually, you're going to see like there's so much overlap. We can't compartmentalize any of those pieces. But Ron talks about how there's types of plants that grow after a fire, and that the types that usually germinate quickest after a fire, they hold a lot of water in their roots, which in turn brings in more groundwater to an area after a burn. So like we think that the land is devastated, and really these plants have a relationship towards the elements, that they're able to, like, the plants that can come up after a fire are holding all the water that's necessary to accumulate water within the earth, to bring back rivers, to bring back streams, to bring more water into the area. And so when those plants that benefit from cultural burns are maintained, the water they hold in their roots returns those rivers and creeks to an area that to collect moisture beneath the soil. So fire obviously needs water, but water also needs fire. And a part of fire suppression, a part of that tactic that's been used for the last 100 years in the United States, has devastated that relationship. So rather than seeing fire as dangerous, traditionally we see fire to speak to the sacredness of fire, right? So only with cultural burns and moderate levels of disturbance can we see higher levels of diversity. Otherwise, suppression could lead to things like megafires, and that imbalance can wreak havoc not only on our physical, emotional, and spiritual bodies, but that of the more than human beings, the animal kingdom, the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom. Like, it's just going to be devastating all around. So with that kind of like with understanding the interconnectivity in place of the elements, we can do the same with our bodies, right? From a metaphysical standpoint, the energy of smoke directly affects the fourth and fifth chakras, right? The fourth is like what inhabits the heart area. This is the energetic area that's ruled by the air element and corresponds to like the lungs, the heart, the thymus, the arms, the hands. And the fifth is our throat, right? This is where the sound exists. This is what corresponds to like our thyroid, our shoulders, our ability to speak, our willpower. Like these are all things that are energetically impacted with smoke. We're talking about the areas that, you know, hold space for love and compassion and communication and connection. And those are what can get strained when we're in active fire, when we're having to deal with smoke. And similarly, physical trauma can manifest emotionally, and emotional trauma can manifest physically. So physical repercussions of fire season, you know, having more constricted breathing, that can impact our emotions. And vice versa, if we are feeling more anxiety or grief or fear or terror, that's going to impact our physical body. That's going to aggravate chronic respiratory imbalances or any sort of the weak parts in our body that usually are impacted first when we're under stress. And it's interesting, like thinking energetically about fire season, there's like preventative, right? There's the fear of it coming, or like the kind of like bracing ourselves for it coming, and like the plans we have to make, both if we're going to stick around in it or if we want to leave and get some reprieve from the smoke. And then there's the active part of living with smoke, and how that affects our breath as humans. And so I want to share this quote. Let's see, my screen share for the first time and see again if this works. There we go. So interconnectivity, this is the beginning, this is the preface of this really fantastic book that I recommend. It's not about fire season, it's more about marine life and Black liberation, but it's a book by Alexis Pauline Gumbs called Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. And the preface feels really, it just is such a beautiful way of explaining or expressing, articulating the interconnectivity of, you know, the elements of us as people, of systems of oppression, systems of power, and fire season. And so I'm going to share this quote. So what is the scale of breathing? Put your hand on your own individual chest as it rises and falters all day. But is that the scale of breathing? You share air and chemical exchange with everyone in the room, everyone you pass by today. Is the scale of breathing within one species? All animals participate in this exchange of release for continued life, but not without the plants. The plants in their inverse process release what we need, take what we give without being asked. And the planet wrapped in an ocean breathing, breathing into sky. What is the scale of breathing? You are part of it now. You are not alone. And if the scale of breathing is collective, beyond species and sentience, so is the impact of drowning. The massive drowning yet unfinished, where the distance of the ocean meant that people could become property, that life could be for sale. I am talking about the middle passage and everyone who drowned and everyone who continued breathing. But I am troubling the distinction between the two. I am saying that those who survived in the underbellies of boats, under each other, under unbreathable circumstances, are the undrowned, and their breathing is not separate from the drowning of their kin and their fellow captives. Their breathing is not separate from the breathing of the ocean. Their breathing is not separate from the sharp exhale of hunted whales, their kindred also. Their breathing did not make them individual survivors. It made a context, the context of undrowning. Breathing in unbreathable circumstances is what we do every day in the chokehold of racial, gendered, ableist capitalism. We are still undrowning. And by we, I don't only mean people like myself whose ancestors specifically survived the Middle Passage, because the scale of our breathing is planetary at the very least. Are you still breathing? This is an offering towards our evolution, towards the possibility that instead of continuing the trajectory of slavery, entrapment, separation, and domination, and making our atmosphere unbreathable, we might instead practice another way to breathe. I don't know what that will look like, but I do know that our marine mammal kindred are amazing at not drowning. So I call on them as teachers, mentors, guides, and I call on you as breathing kindred souls. May we evolve. And I just think it's so powerful. Like she specifically, or they're, yeah, it's such a great book. They're specifically talking about, their experience as a Black person in America. And they're specifically talking about lessons from our marine kin. But what I think is really relevant to what we're talking about today is thinking about breath during smoke, like thinking about what it means to be breathing during fire season and the ways in which all of the systems of oppression have impacted, like the way that it's created what we're in today, the situation that we're in today, and the ways that our more than human kin can offer a way through, the ways that like the resilience of plants that can come up that can literally nourish the soil and come through, the resilience of the animals, that we have so much to learn. And I think, a lot of the ways that human beings center humans is like the most whatever, we lose sight of all the other teachers that we have. And so one of the ways that I think about it is like the anthropocene, right? The way that the environment that we're holding each other in, and all of the more than human beings hostage, we're essentially holding each other hostage in these systems of oppression, and their consequences to this continued domination that impact the health of the planet, of the animals, of the plants, and each other. And so only in recognizing the need for collective liberation and seeing that like fire season is related to racism, is related to capitalism, is related to like ableism, is related to all of these systems of power and oppression, that's the only way that we can actually encourage or motivate some sort of paradigm shift in our communities to create deep and lasting change. Like we don't have to just brace ourselves for the next decade for these fires to burn everything around us. Like we can make change now. And I want that feeling of empowerment to come through today when we get into the plants. And so let's move into some of these medicines, right? The first one I want to start with is actually not even an herb. But it was inspired by this book and this quote, and it's that of the whale. So you can work with essences. The whale essence is essentially made from the bones of a whale. There's different, I work with a whale essence that my friend Lena makes, who's an herbalist. Medicine Lake Herbals is, she's an indigenous practitioner near the Great Lakes. And you can, I think like there's a lot of different essence companies that make essences, but what I love about this essence in relation to fire season is that whale is all about expansion. And a lot of what we can experience with the threat of fire season coming, or when we're in an acute, like when we're in the smoke, is claustrophobia, like this feeling of being trapped, this feeling of being helpless and not able to do much about what's happening. And whale essence is so much about like understanding how infinite our energy is and like expanding our energy beyond the physical form. It's all about like big love and integration and gratitude and connection. This is one of my favorite essences to work with. Karen Sanders is actually my mentor at the Blue Water School, introduced me to whale essence, and I'll never forget that I remember when I was training with her in the clinical program, there was this one day where I think Sarah Holmes, the other teacher of Blue Water, was like teaching, leading the class, and Karen was taking a break in a different room. And her door was closed, but we could hear she was listening to whale sounds. Sometimes she'll do this. So you could just hear that energy like enter our space. And Sarah was like, she got really quiet for a moment. She goes, I know what we need to do. And she just like went around the room and dosed us all with whale essence. And we just like completely stopped what we were doing. And she's like, I think we just need to surrender to this happening now. And it was the first time I'd taken that essence, and it was really expansive. And so we're going to move into like more physical medicine, but I really wanted to start with this essence because I think it can be really valuable in fire season, and really wonderful to share in community and do in community and share with friends. So emotional symptoms, we're going to start emotionally. I know that fire season has a lot of impact on our physical bodies, but I find that what I'm hearing more in my practice from clients is kind of like the emotional impact, and then how that can impact the physical. And so, with fire season, we're looking at a disrupted endocrine system, right? This is when the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response is activated, which we'll get into. This is when we deal with fear, irritability, or grief, sadness, anxiety, depression, insomnia, fatigue, exhaustion, claustrophobia. These are all emotions that are really common during this season. And so when we're thinking preventatively, which is where we're going to start, our preventative medicine is really, I think, where herbal medicine shines. A lot of herbs take a while to get working, like months. And so if you have time to plan ahead this year or next year, working with some of these preventative medicines a few months before you anticipate fire season taking place is a way of building resilience in your bodies. Also, preventatively, reminders of things you already know, right? Hydrate, eat well. You want to kind of decrease inflammation in your body because this is a drain. So inflammation is siphoning off energy of your immune system. So you want to watch any food sensitivities you may have. You might want to take a break from them early in fire season, watch your sugar intake, get lots of rest, right? These are kind of like basics for self-care. Other things you want to be mindful of is like, how much time do you personally need to prepare? How much time do you personally need to evacuate? You want to start a list. You want to start a list and place it somewhere really visible. Where I live in so-called California, CAL FIRE, the website has like really great basic checklists of things you want to keep in mind. Like there's also like a fire evacuation checklist if you just Google that, but it's like, have your driver's license, have your important documents, birth certificates, have all your credit cards, your bank statements, like kind of like your computer, your backup hard drives, like things like that, things you don't really necessarily think of grabbing when you're trying to like think of in those moments, like, what do I really care about that I don't want to burn? So you want to be really mindful of having a list in place, and so that you can pack a bag easily, or having that bag packed by the door when it's active in your area. And then, acute medicine you might need, and that we're going to get into when we get into acute medicine, like what plants or preparations you're going to want to have to help support your body when fire season is here. And things to think about in terms of like how to prepare preventatively. You want to build on your weakest system. So like, where in your body do you fall out of place? Like first, where do you fall out of balance first? Where are you chronically ill perhaps? Where is kind of like the weakest link in your body? Is maybe that's your nervous system, maybe that's your lungs, maybe that's your heart. And you want to also start to consider that for the people that you're caring for, the people in your household, or the people that you care for beyond your household. That might be family, that might be chosen family. You want to look at what organs or systems in your body need the most support, and that of your people. You want to tend to your weaknesses. And this is where tonics come into play. This is where you're really looking at the organs impacted most by fire season, right? Your lungs, your liver, your adrenals, your nervous system, your cardiovascular system. And you want to start preparing preventatively to support and build resilience in those systems. And it's, if you are in a position, if you're in a caretaking position, it's not just for you, it's also for the children or your parents or your chosen family or the people in your neighborhood that you're caring for. So you want to start having those conversations with people and finding out where those weaknesses lie so that you know how to tend for them beforehand, what to recommend as a community herbalist or as a community activist or as a community caretaker, so that you can help prepare. And so let's see, before we move into, we're going to go through body systems and talk about preventative plants. Before we move into that, I would love to just take a moment here. Let's take a couple minutes here to journal, to kind of create that list for ourselves. So let's use this time to either reflect on what personal items or what kind of things you want to make sure you don't leave behind in the event of evacuation. Or you can also use this time to start brainstorming on what those weak organs or weakest systems are of the people that you care for, and start figuring out who are the people that I want to make sure that I'm checking in on during this fire season. What are the areas that they need the most support around, as a way of just kind of like preparing before we jump into the herbs. I think this will be a less overwhelming place than getting like a huge list of plants of different body systems, if we're able to kind of like name or identify what it is that we're actually in need of. So let's take a couple minutes to kind of brainstorm your list for people or for items for fire season, and then we're going to begin with the adrenals. So I'll check in with you in a couple minutes. I'll call you back in. I know that was brief. It's really just kind of I like to think of it as like a marker to create space in our lives to start making these lists and start with these reflections for ourselves so that we can get clear about what our intentions are in those moments of preparation. And so let's get into some of the plants before, I know that we're going to take a break pretty soon here, but I do want to start with some of the plants. So the biggest distinction between preventative, which we're going to spend the bulk of the class with, and acute is really dosage. There's also plants that I'll explain as we go through that benefit from having a few months of being in our system to get working. And so those are also another reason why you'd want to work with them more preventatively than acutely. But really the dosage. And so I am trained energetically traditionally. So meaning oriented towards indigenous traditions, which means that I do lower dosages than Western herbalists. I found it very effective in my practice. I come from a community where it's effective in a lot of other people's practices. And this is where I think is the most respectful place for our bodies, because they don't need a lot to get working. And it's also respectful for the plant, so we're not using too much of a plant. So preventatively, what we're looking at for most of the plants, unless I say otherwise, is about 8 to 12 drops of a tincture once a day, or 4 to 6 ounces of tea once a day. And then when we get into acute a little bit later, it's more frequent and higher dosage. So about 5 to 20 drops 3 times a day of tincture, or a cup of tea 3 times a day. And so we'll return to this as we start moving through the plants, and feel free to pop any questions into the chat as we go. So we're going to start with adrenal support, right? Our adrenals are these like small triangular shaped glands that are located on the top of our kidneys, and they produce hormones that regulate our metabolism, our immune system, blood pressure, but most importantly, stress. They regulate our stress response. So when we, for those of us who are living with less privilege in our culture, our adrenals are taking most of the brunt of that, because they're having to do more work to deal with like everyday stressors. And so getting adrenal support in months before triggering experiences like fire season can really help feed these glands and build resiliency over time. So one of my favorites is milky oats, right? And that's the plant that you see on the left here. We're talking about the when you work with milky oats, it says milky because you want the pod to, if you squeeze the pod, you want sap to come out. So oat straw is also related to this plant. In Spanish, we call milky oats avena, different from the food from the same plant, but we're talking about the milky oat seed pods at the very top. They're deeply nourishing for the nervous system and adrenals. They're honestly like food for the body, for the nervous system. They're really great for burnout. So who's not burned out year 3 of a pandemic, right? This is a really great plant. They're really helpful for recovering from illnesses, or drugs or alcohol use. So recovering from COVID, or recovering from drug use is really helpful. They're really safe for people of all ages, so you can work with children or elders or anyone with delicate health. They also have antidepressive qualities, and they're really highly nutritive. They're also considered a trophorestorative, which means that they work in long-term use for building the system, which is working to restore. So again, this is why as preventative medicine, you want to get like a few months working with milky oats to start like restoring that part of our body, restoring the nervous system, restoring our adrenals. Lara Pacheco, who's an herbalist out of Portland, I'm forgetting the names of, forgive me, I'm forgetting the names of the traditional people up there. Lara Pacheco is an herbalist up there. that calls milky oats medicine for the oppressed. And when Lara said that, I was like, that is exactly what it feels like for me. Like they have this medicine for like, they're really helpful for people that aren't considered good enough, people that are like disposable by like dominant culture standards. So again, people that feel most of the stress because of like the cis white hetero patriarchy. Like this is really great medicine to help rebuild that part of our body. Safe for pregnancy and lactation, but contraindicated if you have grain allergy. So if that is you, you want to test yourself out. So start with a really low dose and check to see if you have reactions, or work with a practitioner, but for mostly really safe for most people. I haven't encountered anyone where it's been a problem in my practice. The one thing about milky oats is that's different from all the other preventative herbs I'm going to talk about is that milky oats really benefits from frequent dosing. So same low dose as preventative, like 8 to 12 drops of tincture, but you want to do it like 5 times a day, 5 or 6 times a day. So like you're really working like a food with milky oats, you're rebuilding and you're renourishing. And so frequent dosing is going to be key for working with this plant. If you're working with tincture, you want to make sure that it was a fresh milky oat tincture, that it was made with fresh plant. And if you're working with tea, you just you can make a decoction from the milky oat tops. But tincture is going to be one of the quickest ways to get that medicine. Borage, borraja, really fabulous adrenal tonic. Really helpful for strengthening courage during hard times. Like spiritually, this medicine is all about courage and resilience. This is tonic to the adrenals because they feed the adrenals. They stimulate the adrenal gland, which is the organ of courage, traditionally speaking, right? And so it's able to, when stimulated, the adrenals are able to secrete adrenaline, which is the fight, flight, freeze, fawn hormone, which primes the body for action in dangerous or stressful times. So this is very spiritually supportive of the adrenals, so it can help with like endurance to see things through to the long haul, building resilience over time. This is really nice for like activists, political people who then start to have trouble like seeing joy, you know, like because of their work and what they're having to deal with. It brings ease and joy for people that have been running from their pain or during hard times. And in curanderismo, we understand borraja for miedo and tristeza, so for fear and sadness. Aires or in curanderismo are just like emotional winds when we are stricken with something that we're having difficulty moving emotionally. You don't want to work with borraja if you have high blood pressure or you want to consult a practitioner before working with this plant. So the dosage is just like preventative dosage. You would work 8 to 12 drops of the tincture once a day, a few months to build that resiliency, to build that courage. And then eleuthero. This is also called Siberian ginseng. This is really fantastic for the adrenals as well. Not a true ginseng. We'll talk about ginseng in a little bit. So you'll notice that the botanical name is different from American ginseng. But this is an adrenal tonic. So if those glands have been overworked, or you've been dealing with prolonged stress for a long time, or prolonged trauma, this is considered an adaptogen. So it helps your body adapt during moments of trauma or stress. So for people who work long hours, people who aren't getting enough sleep, people who are primary caregivers, especially during the pandemic, like adaptogens are really helpful for those prolonged periods of stress. The reason I wrote caution with adaptogens is because there's an exception now, because we are living, I mean, there's always exceptions. I think one thing that can happen with adaptogens is people can get really reliant on them and not make adjustments in their lives. One thing that Karen Sanders always says is don't adapt, change. So what she's speaking towards is like, make like difficult changes in your life to start to remove some of those stresses, that you're not having to constantly like tone your adrenaline, like create change that you're not constantly exposed, if possible, to stress and trauma. But again, I'm including this because a lot of us don't have a choice. And so this can be a really helpful ally to work with. It's contraindicated with certain pharmaceuticals, but however, outside of that, really safe during pregnancy and lactation. Also, this can be very stimulating for some folks for some reason. So if you are unfamiliar with whether Eleuthero or Siberian ginseng is stimulating for you, you want to start with a really, really low dose in the morning. So like 8 drops in the morning, and see how that goes, because some folks find that they can be too stimulating in the evening and have trouble sleeping. So just be mindful and kind of approach with caution if you're dosing yourself or your loved ones, so that not to interrupt your sleep. Let's see. Yeah, let's keep going. Sebastian, are we good, or do you want to take a break in a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, whenever in the next few that you feel is a good moment to pause.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to get through a few more plants.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Me too.
Okay, so emotional support. So preventative emotional support. We're looking at plants that can help us to remain calm, flexible, right? Because there's things that we can't control during fire season, and adaptable. So we're looking at plants that can kind of build that emotional resilience in us, so that a few months later, when that fire season hits, we're able to adjust, adapt, move with the emotions. So California poppy, one of my dear plants I have tattooed on my arm. Dormidera in Spanish. We work with the whole plant, preferably fresh. So if you're working with tincture, you want to work with a fresh plant tincture. You just get more of the medicine. And this is really helpful for folks who experience anxiety from self-imposed pressure. So like type A personalities, or overachievers, or folks that like are in positions of like caregiving, or like matriarchs of your family. I'm speaking from experience, like people that like tend to add more onto their plate. This can be really helpful in easing things over time, so that you have more resilience when your body needs it. It's also really helpful for the mind-body split, meaning like if you get caught in your head a lot, or you're feeling kind of like a disconnection between like your thoughts and your physical body, this can be really helpful in like integrating that kind of disconnection, and really helpful with cravings. So it's a part of the poppy family, right? Very different than opium poppy, not as strong, and doesn't interact as much with pharmaceuticals as opium poppy does, but does have that medicine, has some of that medicine. So can be helpful with like addiction, cravings, like food cravings, drug cravings. If that's a coping mechanism, a coping tool that you use in times of stress or trauma, California poppy can really help bring some ease in, and is really great with kids. This is one of the plants that I give, this and chamomile, manzanilla is like the 2 plants that my son takes the most. And with kids, you dose real low, like 5 drops tops. They're really sensitive. Really helpful if emotional pain has gotten physical. So like if you notice that your body starts responding to like emotional stress or trauma, California poppy can be really helpful. And because they're in the opium family, they can be helpful with minor pain. So like minor physical pain, you want to start, you want to increase the dosaging if you're using them for pain management. So you'd go much higher than like 8 to 12 drops, like 20 or 30 drops a couple times a day, if that's where you're working. But again, you want to consult a practitioner if you are on pharmaceuticals, because when you start getting into higher dosages, there can be some contraindications. Skullcap. That's the skullcap flower. That's actually the Lateriflora, the California skullcap. There's different kinds of skullcap. Escutelaria en español. This is also best fresh as a tincture. If you work with a dried plant tincture, they're more sedated. So if that is what you're looking for, more of like a sedating feeling, you can work with the dry. But if you're working fresh, you're really getting more of the nervous system support that we're calling in today for preventative medicine. So this is like a tonic, right, to the nervous system, really building and nourishing to the nervous system. Skull cap is especially helpful with reactivity. So like if you're quick to anger, for example, if that's like a stress response you have, skull cap can really bring some, it can create space between you and your reactions so that you have more time to decide how you want to respond to something. So really cooling to the emotions, really helpful for relaxing tension when you aren't ready to put that tension down. Again, so related to that reactivity, really feeding to the nervous system so that you're less crackly or irritable. Really helpful for hyper functioning nerves. So like if you jump or startle easy, or if your loved one does, this is a really nice plant to start working preventatively to help build their nervous system, to help ease that parts of them. And really helpful for like nervous systems that are, when there's exhaustion that leads to depression. You want to be careful with some mood altering drugs and skull cap. So if you're working preventatively and also you know, working with mood altering drugs, you might want to keep those in separate parts of your time. And then vervain. So that's the vervain plant. That's actually the vervain at Blue Water. So it looks really dry because they have like a drought tolerant garden in Fort Jones where Karen and Sarah's school is. But they are really resilient. Vervain spreads really easily where we live and doesn't require a lot of water. They're really great for the drought. So that's the pictures, the verbena hastata. You can also work with the officinalis and you work with the aerial parts. This is also cooling like skullcap. And also one of the things that's nice about this nervine is that they're also cooling and stimulating to the liver. So you're able to get some of that like liver detox if your liver's like overworked or heated with this plant, and also get that nervine tonic to the nerves. And I think of vervain mostly like first and foremost for mind chatter. So like looping negative thinking, looping like critical thinking, looping worry. Like if you kind of get caught in these like hamster wheels of like fear or irritability. So different from skullcap, and that skullcap's more about like addressing the reactivity. Vervain's more for like when you're stuck in these, like when you're stuck in your head and you're stuck in these loops. And this can be really helpful, again, for building resilience during fire season because of that agitation that can happen. So yeah, liver action means that this plant is bitter. So it has a very bitter taste. So something to keep in mind if you're working with folks and your communities, that a lot of people in our dominant culture have, because of dominant culture, have adversities to bitter tastes. But we'll get into that in a little bit because bitter is actually really important for the body. And contraindicated in pregnancy. And let's do one more body system before we take a break. Does anyone have any questions so far? Let me just look at the, no, we're good. Okay, feel free to unmute since we're such a small group, or just put it in the chat as we go.
I actually have just a couple questions about milky oats in particular. We tend to use glycerin rather than alcohol for our tinctures. And I'm curious if milky oats do well tincturing in glycerin.
I think so. I don't work with glycerins personally. I work more with vinegars for non-alcoholic, but I know that milky oats to prepare as tincture, the best way to do it is to create, decoct and then blend, because you want to, it's the only plant I use in a blender to tincture, because you want to break the seed pod open and get the latex, the sap out into the blender. And I think that process would benefit from then adding glycerin to it. And would say that you might, I mean, I know that alcohol is more drying than glycerin is in general, so you might not get all of the constituents, but I think that you would still get really potent medicine, in my opinion, because I make milky oat vinegars all the time.
Do
And
you? Okay, because we work with vinegars too.
yeah. Yeah, I
So
think that
vinegar
would be,
works well. Okay, great. Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question. Yeah, feel free to unmute if anyone has any more questions. Okay, deep immunity. Another place where preventative medicine shines, because some of the plants I'm going to talk about here really take like 2 or 3 months to begin working in the body. So they're not really going to be effective in acute situations. So the stronger our immunity is, right, the more that we can handle before we get sick. Deep immunity is a big conversation for the pandemic and equally important for fire season. It's referring to like our vitality, our physical resilience. And things to keep in mind is like when we're evacuated, we don't really have a ton of control over where we end up. And so we may be in close quarters with a lot more people. There's more opportunities for germs to spread in general. So making sure that your immune system is strong before fire season comes up with these plants can be really helpful. One preparation I'll talk about quickly before we get into the individual plants is fire cider. If you've never heard of this, it's a vinegar that usually has honey, which makes it an oxymel preparation with like onion, garlic, horseradish, aromatic herbs like rosemary, thyme. What else did they put in that? Ginger, burdock. And you can take, you create this infusion in honey and vinegar, apple cider vinegar usually, and you can take a shot of it daily to help boost your immune system. It's, it's called fire cider, so it's spicy, it's fiery. I like to take my fire cider I pour like the shot into a glass of apple cider or of sparkling water, and that makes it more palatable for me because you can feel it burn. But you can also use it like in salad dressings. You can put it on your food. A few years back, there was a free fire cider movement because this new company tried to trademark this like super old tradition preparation, and the herbalists that were in the lawsuit against this company won, which is a huge deal for the herbal community. So if you're curious more about that, you can Google free fire cider and get some recipes or learn more about the political history behind capitalism trying to take medicine and trademark it. Okay, so astragalus. This is a root. That's the plant, but we work with the root. And this is considered a deep immune modulator, meaning that it builds the it's a tonic, but it also builds the immune system over time. What's great about astragalus is like big medicine, right? Antibiotic, antiviral, anti-cancer. But it's really a kind of like a mild flavor. You get them in like, they look like tongue depressors sometimes, or you can get them in like chips, the roots and chips, and you can add them to broths, like any foods that you cook for long periods of time. Beans, you want to put them in like a sack so you can easily filter them out because they're really, you can't eat them. They're like, they never actually break down. They're pretty woody. But they have a really sweet flavor, and you can put them in anything that you're slow cooking for a long period of time. And in that way, you're able to ingest daily as food. But you can also make a tincture of the root or make a decoction of the root. So that's a simmered tea. And what's great about astragalus is that they increase white blood cells, they activate T cells, they increase vitality, they actually promote tissue regeneration. They clean and alkalize the blood. And then spiritually, they help take us out of our ego and into our hearts. So they help us to get like deeper within ourselves, more intimate, like under the surface of things. So this is really strong medicine for building immunity. Like I have clients that have some chronic like conditions that happen like seasonally throughout the year. And so we have them on astragalus for like 9 months out of the year. And just, you take breaks. It's important with any herb to take a break every few months for about a month and In those moments, you can work with more acute immune support, which we'll get into later. But astragalus is really nice for kind of building that immunity over time. One thing that you want to keep in mind with astragalus is if you want to discontinue working with astragalus if you get sick. So not in an acute illness, because they can potentially drive the illness in further. So like if you're working with astragalus and you get a cold or a flu, you want to stop working with that medicine until you're recovered, and then you can continue building that deep immunity. And then reishi, another plant that takes a few months to get going. This one is much more bitter than astragalus. So you can work similarly and put reishi in your foods, but in smaller doses. And if you're particularly sensitive to bitter, you want to be mindful that it's going to impart a bitter flavor to your broth or to your stew or to your congee or whatever it is that you're adding them to. Pipa in Spanish is how we say reishi. This is also a deep immune modulator and tonic, so really building to the immune system. And what reishi does that's a little different than astragalus is that they have an affinity for supporting lung tissue. So nice for the pandemic, nice for fire season, really helpful for like detoxifying. So like reishi helps our bodies metabolize environmental contaminants that settle in our lungs during fire season. So if you're able to start getting that medicine in, your body has more resilience to metabolize those contaminants once the smoke hits. This is really helpful for people that deal with asthma or bronchitis. It's best long-term, so like best to like get a few months to get going, but you can get some short-term relief with reishi if you're dealing with asthma or bronchitis. It's just not going to be, it's not the same as like, it doesn't modulate short-term the way it does if you're working with this plant over a few months. And then those are some contraindications. You want to be careful with some autoimmune conditions and certain pharmaceutical medications. So again, work with a practitioner if that corresponds to you. And then the last few I have before we break, I don't have slides for because they're foods that you are most likely already familiar with. So shiitake is one. Shiitake is actually super medicinal, great source of protein, zinc, potassium, B vitamins. They are a medicinal mushroom in that, again, you want to work with shiitake a couple months before, start building that resilience over time. So you can eat them as foods, you can tincture them. Shiitake tincture is delicious. If you're tincturing medicinal mushrooms, you just want to cook them for 12 to 24 hours before you add the alcohol to them. But they're really great, shiitake, specifically for pulling heavy metals from the body. So think of like the smoke that you're ingesting and all those heavy metals that are carried in the smoke. Shiitake can be really helpful for drawing those heavy metals out, modulating or balancing the immune system. Also very hepatoprotective, so meaning protective of the liver, and antiviral. So shiitake has a lot of good medicine if you don't have access to reishi. And then oysters, another one, a little less common than shiitake in grocery stores, but also just as delicious, also big medicine, supports deep immunity. You can tincture the oyster mushroom, you can decoct the oyster mushroom, you can cook with them as food. They're really anti-cancer, they help to inhibit tumors. They're also really helpful in pulling heavy metals from the body. By way they're able to like convert and revert toxins from the body. So again, like building that kind of resilience before the smoke comes through. And then the last one is garlic. Really easily accessible kitchen herb, super antimicrobial, antispasmodic, really clearing of the sinuses, and strengthens the heart action. So it can be a really nice cardio tonic as well if that's a weak point in your loved one. Really helpful. Garlic is helpful for chronic bronchitis or chronic asthma. I mean, if you think about like the affinity, an easy way to kind of remember that health or that herbal action in garlic is like the way that garlic breath exists, right? Because garlic is excreted through the lung. So it has lung action. That's a good way to remember that you're working with garlic, you're able to fight the microbes in the lungs. So you can work with garlic preventatively by chopping up a clove a day. And I mean, it's really hard to just take garlic on its own. Like I like to put it in honey, and then ingesting that once a day. And you can do that, or like a couple times a week if once a day feels like too much, but really helping to build that immunity. And you can also work with garlic once you're sick. So both preventatively and acutely. Yeah, before we move on to respiratory support, do y'all want to take a little break? Does this feel like a good
That sounds
time?
great. Perfect.
How
Yeah.
long should we do?
Let's do 10 minutes. So 55,
Okay,
3:55 EST. All
thanks,
right.
Sebastian.
Beautiful.
Okay, welcome back. I'm going to jump right back into plants since we have so many to talk about. Okay, so respiratory support. Here we're really talking about our lungs and our nasal passages. This is the section where you want to be mindful of the thermal energetics of the plants you're working with. So you want to be mindful if you're working with a neutral plant versus one that is drying versus one that is moistening. And when working preventatively, once your respiratory system is no longer to one extreme or the other, then you can continue working tonically with neutral herbs. And so the most, I think the biggest star in herbs for fire season is really mullein, because this is of neutral temperature. This is a really classic respiratory tonic. Like if you walked away with any one plant for preventative or acute care, mullein would be the plant. Gordo lobo in Spanish. This is very soothing and can be moistening if needed, and can be anti-inflammatory if needed. Really relaxing expectorant, meaning helps to like get mucus or anything that's caught in our respiratory system out. Really, like you'll see mullein growing in like distressed areas of land that's been like clear cut, or like empty lots, because mullein actually is really helpful for like soil regeneration in the same way that mullein's really helpful in the lungs for regeneration. Really opening to the lungs and bronchi, which means that there's an increase of airflow. Really helpful for like damaged cilia. So cilia is like the little fine hairs that line the lungs. They can actually like help heal when they've been damaged from smoke. So for folks that are smokers, or folks that have endured fire season, smoke season in the past, they can help heal that lining, because the cilia is what filters toxins that come into the lungs from being absorbed into our body. So you want the cilia to be resilient. They're also really toning to the mucilage that lines the lungs, as well as like mucilage in our intestines and stomach. Really helpful for hacking cough, whether it's dry or wet. Really helpful for like irritated or inflamed throats. Really helpful for chronic respiratory conditions, so like asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or emphysema or chronic bronchitis. Really helpful for premature babies, because the lungs are the last to develop. So it's really nice to give like mullein tea or tincture to the nursing parent, because that'll get into the chest or the body milk, and then that will help heal the premature baby's lungs. So like overall, super, super strong medicinal plant. Mullein is best as a tea, meaning that like the water solubility really is what draws out most of the medicine, but you can also work with mullein tincture. The root is a little bit stronger, and also like totally not necessary unless you're working with some pretty intense respiratory conditions. So you can work with the mullein leaf tea or tincture. and really safe for everyone. I recommend for folks that are smokers to roll some mullein into your spliffs or your cigarettes or your joints, because that will help offset the damage that inhaling smoke does to your lungs. And so this is a plant we'll return to in the acute, but for preventative measures, this is a really fantastic plant to start working with. Yerba Santa. So again, thermal energetics with respiratory plants is important to keep in mind, because Yerba Santa is really drying. So really powerful decongestant, like accumulated phlegm. Like this is one I think of for my mom. She's a tobacco smoker and she constantly, you know, like has the clearing throat thing going on that I had at the beginning of class. Like that's how she lives. And so I send her Yerba Santa tincture all the time, particularly like leading up to fire season, that she can start to get her respiratory system more in balance, because Yerba Santa is really anti-inflammatory to the bronchi and the lungs and the sinuses. Really helpful for moist conditions. So it can make dry conditions worse. So you want to be mindful. If that's what you have on hand, you want to pair it with something more moistening, like more of like the demulcent herbs like marshmallow or licorice, which we'll get into when we talk about acute care. And then if you are dealing with, if you want something moistening versus drying, comfrey is a really great plant to work with preventatively, because they're really moistening, really demulcent. Like they're like, they have some mucilage, which is what makes them kind of slimy. They're really soothing. That sliminess, that demulcent quality is really soothing and moistening to the tissues, because our mucous membranes are supposed to be slimy and like moist. And comfrey is also expectorant, so really helpful for like when mucus is really deep in the lungs and is either impacted or like too dry, like it's at the bottom sometimes, and you're having trouble like moving it, you want to moisten it and get it out. Also considered a vulnerary, which is another, it's like a herbal action term that means promoting the healing of tissue through cellular granulation. So like anytime there's tissue damage, like in the lungs, like if you are dealing with like dry lungs due to past fire seasons, comfrey is a really nice one to kind of like bring more moisture and encourage that cell proliferation in the bronchi or in the lungs, in the lining of the lungs. And then spiritually, comfrey is super protective, really grateful for like big grief, like really soothing and moistening to grief as well, like what we hold in the lungs, right? Really helpful for like when grief is presenting as deep sorrow, or grief is presenting as heartache or agony or torment. You can work with like lower doses of physical medicine of comfrey to get to access more of that spirit medicine, to bring in more of that integrative protection. And so those are kind of the three thinking for respiratory preventative, like mullein for more neutral temp, Yerba Santa for more of that drying action, and comfrey for more of that moistening. When we get into acute, we'll start adding some more plants that you can work with. This is a tea blend that Sarah Holmes recommends whenever she does an Herbal Highway show on fire prevention or fire care, herbs for fire season. And I really like this tea, so I'm sharing it with y'all today. It's 2 parts mullein leaf, 1 part nettles. Nettles is a plant that I like to think of as like an herbal multivitamin. They're like super, super, super nutritive for the body. And then red clover for more of that like blood cleansing support. If you don't have access to a 1/2 part red clover, you can work with cleavers, which is like another spring tonic that cleavers has more of like a lymphatic support. So you're like able to like get your lymph moving. And you can also add peppermint to all of these parts for a more familiar flavor profile. Nettles particularly can be off-putting for some folks, like it has a lot of minerals, has a lot of medicine, and it can taste kind of intense for some folks. So adding peppermint there can like help ease any of the taste. I just saw a question. What provision do you, yeah, so comfrey you can work with comfrey root, but honestly, you don't need to. The leaves have just as much medicine. So you can work with a tincture of the leaves, or you can work with, or a root if that's what you have. I'm just saying, like, you don't necessarily need to harvest the root for comfrey to get medicine. The leaves are just as medicinal. Or you can make a tea from comfrey. Okay, so liver support. So liver, right? This is the organ in our body that processes the toxins in our blood, cleans out the blood toxins. So when there's like houses burning or toxins in the air, our liver really needs extra support to for those routes of excretion in the body. The liver is also connected to being constipated, which can happen to folks during fire season. So if the stool spends too much time in the large intestine, you're actually reabsorbing the toxins back into your body, which is what can happen with constipation. So you want to make sure, and then the liver has to do all that work of like detoxifying and, you know, all over again. So you really want to make sure that going into fire season, your liver is as strong and resilient as possible. And there's another, yes, vinegar tincture. Yeah, vinegar tincture of the leaves is fantastic. Vinegar tinctures in general with like the leafier parts of the plant tend to pull out more of the minerals from the plant in general. Thanks for that question. So in terms of like preventative medicine for the liver, milk thistle is Cardo Mariano. This is one of the best liver tonics. Milk thistle literally helps to regrow your liver, like regenerates the liver like no other plant's done. Like there have been studies of like livers that have lost like 70% of their capacity. Like working with milk thistle is really helpful to rebuild. Like this is strong medicine. You work with the seeds. So that's the plant, the thistle, and then once they go to seed, you would harvest the seeds, or you can purchase seeds at herb stores or online. You want to keep the seeds in your fridge if possible, because seeds tend to go rancid. A lot of things that most people don't think go rancid, like oils and vinegars and stuff. So you want to keep your seeds in the fridge, and you would work with a seed tincture, or you can make a decoction so you can simmer a tea of your seeds, or you can literally put the seeds in like a pepper grinder and like grind them over your food. This is extremely hepatoprotective, so extremely protective of the liver, really stimulating to both the liver and the gallbladder, really helpful for recovery of drugs. So like your liver has had to do more of that work in maintaining when it's constantly having to detox from drug use. And so you can work with milk thistle in conjunction with drug use as like a harm reduction approach, or in the recovery of drug use. So drugs, alcohol, like all of the things that can be impacted on the liver, or like heavy pharmaceutical use that get, if your pharmaceuticals get metabolized in the liver, you can work with milk thistle to help rebuild the liver from that use. Slows down the degeneration of liver from fats, really helpful for hepatitis or cirrhosis of the liver or a fatty liver. Milk thistle is just like slightly warming in terms of temperature, and really emotionally cleansing. So like really helpful for like healing broken trust, or aiding in forgiveness energetically. And like forgiveness in the sense of like release, right? Not necessarily like forgiving someone for harm, but releasing yourself from that power that they have over us. And then burdock. Burdock is a pretty accessible herb as food. Like not every grocery store, but some specialty or more like healthy wise grocery stores carry burdock. It's called gobo in Japanese. This is a really nutritive tonic to lots of body systems. So we're talking specifically liver right now, but also for like the intestinal tract, for the lymph, for the blood, for the kidneys. In the blood, it's specifically very blood cleansing. Burdock has so much medicine. The tincture is really delicious. You can make a decoction. What's really cool about burdock is I've talked to so many different herbalists about this, and I don't know why. I've never gotten a clear answer, but sometimes when you make a decoction, when you like simmer a tea of burdock, so it's usually pretty like white, like creamy looking. Sometimes it's like green, like it's creamy with like a green hue. And it's like total alchemy. I don't know why it happens sometimes and not others. Like I've tried so many different ways, like not peeling the outside, peeling the outside. Like sometimes it just comes out green and it's such magic and really tasty. But you can also work with burdock as food. You can put it into your stews. You can pickle burdock. You can, Japanese culture has a lot of different recipes for burdock if you're looking for ways to work with this plant. Really helpful energetically for softening rage or resentment.
Question.
Oh yeah.
As far as like a time to harvest, like
Burdock.
like in the progression of the growth of the plant,
You
do you have any
generally,
recommendations?
you generally want to do this in the fall when the energy is starting to, so like in the spring and summer, the energy is all like outward and in the aerial parts of the plant. And then once that energy starts to fall back down into the roots as things start to cool down, burdock has, I wouldn't say like more medicine there, but like you're really aligned with the energy that's moving within the plant if you harvest in the fall. And that's generally like if you're ordering fresh roots from like herb farms, they generally offer them in the fall, like early fall. Thank you for that question. How is burdock as an alcohol or vinegar? Yeah, I have made a vinegar. So I have made burdock vinegar. I've made burdock oxymel too. I'm trying to remember. Whenever I make the tincture, I make a decoction. So I make tinctures traditionally, I mean like oriented towards indigenous practices. So when I make tinctures, I generally make a tea first and then add alcohol to it and then let the alcohol work with the alcohol both acts as a preservative and draws out whatever constituents didn't come out through the water. Burdock is very water soluble. So my guess is that the vinegar is as potent as a tincture. I hope that helps answer your question. Okay, so lastly, cardiovascular. The one plant that comes in mind for, let me just close this chat so I can see, there it is hawthorn. Often you'll see like hawthorn berries is common. The leaf and flower tends to be more medicinal than the berries in terms of what we're talking about today. So if you have access to leaf and flower, I recommend that. If not, berries are fine. But hawthorn really is a great tonic over time for improving like the tone of the muscle, improving like oxygen intake into the heart, improving circulation, and then all of the energetics that go around our hearts. So like soothing fear of trust, soothing fear of connection, really helpful for like, just improving tone overall as a preventative medicine of the heart. The berries tend to be more antioxidant than the leaf and flower. So if that's something that you're looking for in medicine, you would work with the berries over the.
And that picture.
Oh,
yeah, right.
That's a mistake. That's still milk thistle. Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
Unless hawthorn just transmuted it.
I know. When I saw it first, I was like, "Whoa."
No, that's not hawthorn. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay, before we get to endangered plants, one more. Let me close this really fast. A couple things to keep in mind. Oh, we talked about nutrition tonics already. Yeah, so like that tea, that Sarah Holmes's tea that I mentioned that has like the nettle and the red clover and the mullein, and you can add peppermint or cleavers to it. It's really nice to start working with like those what do they call them? Like nourishing infusions, those teas that really benefit from like overnight infusions, or that really have a lot of like minerals and nutrition to help kind of rebuild the system leading up to fire season. And so that's kind of plants to keep in mind for preventative. And I wanted to spend the bulk of time there for today's class because, like I said at the beginning, preventative medicine is really where herbal medicine shines, especially in the beginning, like when you're first starting to get to know plants, because they just like exist on a different time frame than like we're allowed in capitalism. And so like getting into the rhythm of like working with plants over a long period of time to help something in the future can be a really beautiful way of like actually starting to feel very acutely their medicine. As we move into more active, so I'm going to move to active a little bit quicker because we're going to cover some of the plants we already talked about, and then I'm going to offer some more to think about in terms of active. And so something to think about with active is like, you know, thinking about who it is that we're serving, like who it is that we're showing up for to caretake, who it is that like within ourselves and within our families and whoever it is, like that list that we started to in the beginning is to really try to develop that and think about what kind of medicines you want, and then creating like a kit, like a first aid kit for fire season that I had hoped to have it ready by this class, but honestly, I've had a lot going on in my world lately, but I'm hoping that today I'm offering enough plants where y'all can start to like prepare your own for your loved ones. And I'm happy to offer resources of places to purchase herb from, or like techniques on, you know, growing plants, or other herbalists that might already have kits. Because really, I just want folks to have like as many tools as possible going into fire season as possible. And so thinking about some of these plants and during the active, when the smoke hits and the fires are either close or the smoke is just like invading and not leaving for a while, these are some of the plants like we're going to look towards to help support our bodies. And before we get into a little bit of the plants, I just kind of want to like frame a little bit about what we're talking about energetically. And one way that I like to think of it is, so like when we're in the smoke, right? Like smoke traditionally, the way that I've been taught, the way that like my teachers and maestros have taught me is like, when we're working with smoke sacredly, smoke is like what brings our prayers to spirit, to great spirit, to creator. And so, you know, like if you're working with pipes, or if you're working with smoke cleansing medicine, or even in the Temazcal, like when you're working with smoke as an element, it's very much intertwined with prayer in traditional cultures. And so I want to offer that idea that when smoke season comes, it's smoke. And yeah, there's a lot in the smoke. There's a lot of like toxins that we need to be mindful of. There's a lot that we need to protect ourselves from in that smoke, but it's also smoke, like as an element, smoke. And so how can we like offer our prayers into that smoke? How can we like what can we offer spiritually to go to weave into those toxins that go into the smoke that can then reach spirit? And like thinking about when we're in active fire season, like how can we orient our spiritual bodies, our energetic bodies, to bring relief? So you know how like so one example that comes to mind is when I gave birth to my son 4 years ago. Karen and Sarah, my mentors, Blue Letter School, were there. And one thing that Sarah told me afterwards that was so significant to me was that during labor, she made a point, during my labor, she made a point to make sure that she relieved herself of, like when she had to pee, she went the moment she felt it, because she didn't want to hold, like she didn't want to have any holding energy in her body, because she wanted that kind of release energy to affect me spiritually during labor. And I think about that so often in the sense of like energetically, the way that our choices and spiritual decisions can impact the lives of those around us. And so like one thing I like to think about with kind of the interconnectedness of all beings is like, how can we hold space for relief of claustrophobia or grief or stress or fear? Like what sort of meditations can we have, not just for ourselves and like our households, but like for the animals that are impacted, for the plants that are impacted, for like the stress of the act of fire and smoke and how that impacts like those around us. And so finding a way to orient towards like, what can I do internally to help like spread out an energy that can bring some relief in some way to all the other beings that are impacted by fire season. And that can look like putting out buckets of water for the animals that are trying to escape fire, because they're just as starved for water as the plants are. And so like you can even dose some of that water with like a drop of whale essence, you know, but putting out water so that like the deer or wherever, depending on where you live, that are trying to escape or move away from the smoke can get access to water. Another idea is, you know, if working with grief during fire season, it's the medicine in our tears, like lágrimas, medicina de lágrimas, like working with onions and releasing all of that, those tears, that grief, and then capturing your tears and offering them to the plants as a way of like, I see you, I'm also in grief. Let's like live, let's connect in this together. Like there's so many small things that you can do that can have such profound impacts on our communities, because it's very it's an acknowledgement that we are interconnected and that we can't, you know, collective liberation, we can't if we're not all free, we can't get free until we're all free. And so like some of the ideas to think about, and I wanted to do some journaling around that to see if there was like space, to see if there was like other like energetic practices or spiritual practices that could bring collective healing to more than human beings, other ways that we can support plant, animal, and mineral kingdom, just so we can share those kind of like tools together. And I'm wondering if maybe I should start with a couple of these plants, and if we have time in the end, we can do that together. How does that feel? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Okay. So let's come back to that. I really want to get through some of these active ones. But I really just want to like, if at all, like just support the idea of having these types of conversations within our communities so that we can start doing that spiritual work collectively, and encouraging each other to do that collectively. Okay, so let's see. Before we get into the herbs, just quickly, like, I mean, things you probably already know, mask up, like an N95 is ideal for smoking conditions, but like any mask will be better than nothing, especially if your cloth mask has a filter. You want to increase your water intake. You want to stay inside wherever possible, or use air purifiers, or check online for DIY suggestions. There's like a lot of like box fan DIY situations to help like encourage like purified air inside. Light movement, you know, like light movement activates our lymphatic system, and that supports the transfer of fluids and acts as a filter for our immune system, for the smoke particles. So some things to keep in mind. But let's get into some of these plants again. Okay, so before we get into the acute, I just want to make a quick note on endangered plants, because there's a lot of plants that can be really helpful for the respiratory system during acute fire season. And I just want to name that urgency, the urgency that we feel during acute situations of trauma or stress, should not mean that it should not be licensed to further harm plants. And this can happen really often. These three plants here, American ginseng, lomatium, and osha, are all endangered. American ginseng is cultivated. So if you are going to work with this plant, just make sure you're buying organic cultivated plant. because the over harvesting in the wild is intense of these plants. I don't advocate wild harvesting or wild crafting in general because of how it perpetuates patterns of colonization. We don't really have a ton of time to talk about that here, but I'm happy to talk about that with anyone who would like afterwards, or an email or social media. Lomatium and Osha are not cultivated. Osha, I'm not sure if anyone's ever successfully cultivated Osha. Lomatium, there might be people cultivating now. But all these plants are really great for strengthening the lungs, great in the respiratory plant. They're really, really, really amazing special medicine, but they're endangered. And so out of respect for the plants, I am offering the idea to rethink working with these plants specifically, because there are so many other ones that we can work with, like acute care, plantain. So beginning with respiratory, two that we've already talked about that can be really helpful acutely are mullein and comfrey. We talked about why in the screen slides before. Just keep in mind that when you're working acutely, you'd want to increase the dosage. So again, acute dosage would be 5 to 20 drops, like 3 times a day of a tincture, and like a cup, a half a cup to a cup is good, like 3 times a day of a tea. So mullein and comfrey are ones to think about. Plantain is another one that works really well acutely during active fire season, because plantain is really drying. So like really helpful for like healing wounds that are deep in the lungs or restoring lungs. So like if you've been feeling fine and all of a sudden smoke has hit or fire season has hit and you're having trouble breathing, or you're feeling your lungs are feeling really raw, plantain can be really nice for any of those like festering wounds, both physically, like plantain is one of like the best first aid plants for like festering wounds physically, but also spiritually. If those like, if you're noticing that emotionally there's like deep things that are like kind of deep, they're like hard to get to or hard to access, and they're kind of festering, like you can work with plantain in this way. And these 3, licorice, marshmallow root, and wild cherry, that's what they look like in commerce when they come. These are all very mucilaginous. So again, that word for like slimy. So when you're in fire season and it's smoky and you're having like dryness in your lungs, dryness in your cough, dryness in your breathing, these 3 are really fantastic. Just to make a quick distinction, licorice, right, has that taste. So you want to think about really helpful for like protecting mucous membranes in the nose and the throat. Licorice also has some hormonal medicine, and also is really helpful for like adrenal exhaustion. So like if you're noticing dryness in your respiratory tract, but you're also feeling a lot of stress, or the stress is feeling like out of control, licorice can be a really nice one to work with. You'd want to make a cold infusion of all of these 3. Cold infusion means you just make a tea with cold water instead of hot water, because that cold water is what's going to bring out that kind of slimy mucilaginous medicine that you want to coat any of the dryness in your body. Marshmallow root, also very mucilaginous, moisturizing, specifically really nice for sore throats or any general dryness. So like nice in the respiratory tract for dryness, but like if you're generally dry, like a lot of my older clients that have like post-menopause, they experience a lot of like dryness in the pelvic region. This is a really nice plant to bring more moisture into the body. Dryness in the vagina, dryness in like and on the skin, dryness like in general, marshmallow root can be really hydrating in that sense, and especially helpful with constipation. So if that's part of your stress response, you can work with marshmallow root. I really like doing a cold infusion of marshmallow root with nettles and damiana. Damiana is a really warming nervine that is considered an aphrodisiac that's like really soothing to the nervous system. And so that combination together is really delicious and loosening to the spirit and physical body. And then wild cherry bark. Also very mucilaginous, but specifically really nice in like bringing up mucus. So if you're noticing that like there's dryness, but there was also mucus in your response to smoke, wild cherry bark can be really astringent and somewhat sedating for that. So like helpful with like spastic coughs, or like if you're having trouble sleeping because you're coughing because of the smoke, wild cherry bark can be one that you can work with to get those, like to get the cough to actually be beneficial and to help you sleep at night. There is a slight toxicity with wild cherry bark, so you don't want to work with this plant for a long period of time, which is why I'm putting these three. Same with licorice. What marshmallow root is pretty like non-toxic and safe for everyone, but with licorice and wild cherry bark, you don't want to work for like extended periods of time. So like work for a month and then take a break. But these are definitely not, licorice and wild cherry are not preventative like supports. They're more like they shine in kind of the acute moment, which is why they're helpful here. Dandelion is another. So we talked about milk thistle and burdock for liver support during fire season. Dandelion is really great for acute too, and is a little more accessible than milk thistle, in that really helpful for the liver, really helpful for stimulating bioflow, really helpful for like stimulating peristalsis, which is like the way that your body is able to like move stool, like the way your body is able to like move towards excretion, and really helpful spiritually for like repressed or denied emotions. So like if you're in acute fire season and you're noticing that like your liver or your digestion is being impacted, and you're noticing that like you're having trouble like admitting things to yourself, admitting how you feel, or like having trouble accessing your emotions, or maybe you're kind of irritable, like dandelion and skullcap could be a really nice combination together for like moving those repressed or denied emotions through. Let's see, elder, that is also the wrong photo. That's plantain. Sorry about that. Elder is, so we talked about medicinal mushrooms and astragalus for building immunity. Elder is really nice for acute moments. Elder is also somewhat modulating, so also somewhat building, but elder really shines in like acute moments of immune stress. So like if you're needing an immune stimulant, if you're like elder is really nice for folks that work at schools where like there's colds going around with children, or if you have to fly, you can like start working with elder like a week before you get on an airplane. If this is a weak spot for you, like if you notice that during times of stress or fire season or smoke, your immune system takes a toll, elder can be really nice to kind of like stimulate your immune system so that you don't get sick. The one thing about elder is that the seeds are somewhat toxic. So if you're making your own elder preparations, you want to be really mindful to filter out the seeds, because they can disrupt the digestive tract. And then nervines. So we talked about skullcap and who else did we talk about? California poppy and vervain for like preventative medicine. In the acute sense, I feel like chamomile always gets overlooked, and chamomile is actually really, really, really big medicine. And so I'm making a distinction here. I'm not talking about like chamomile, the beverage tea, like the tea bag that you steep for like 5 minutes and get at like a tea shop or whatever, or if you do at night. I'm talking about chamomile that's like that you've infused as tea for like at least 30 minutes, but preferably overnight, or a tincture of chamomile. So like the longer that you make the medicine for, the more time the medicine has to draw out and get into your menstruum, whether that be water or vinegar or alcohol. Chamomile makes a great vinegar, by the way. So I'm talking about chamomile as a medicinal tea or medicinal formula versus the beverage tea. And if prepared medicinally, this is a really strong nervine, particularly for people who hold tension in their stomachs. Like that's so me. I'm a Virgo, and like if I get nervous or anxious or scared, like my digestion is immediately impacted. chamomile is really soothing and warming to both digestion and the stomach and like the digestive tract, but also really soothing for the nerves, like feeds the nervous system. So really nice for like anger that's related to fear or an acute anxiety. So again, you just want to make sure that you're preparing as medicine, not preparing for as beverage tea. And then the other plant that's really nice acutely is passion flower, passiflora. This is really like passion flower is unnerving. That's also really great for like physical tension in the body. So translating that to what we're talking about, this is really great for people who hold emotional tension in the physical, or who have like a low tolerance of chronic illnesses, or in this case, a low tolerance of chronic fire season. If you're like noticing that it's impacting your emotions and you're starting to feel it physically, this is a really great plant to work with. If you're having trouble sleeping, if you're noticing like restless leg syndrome, or like you feel the anxiety physically in your body, like sometimes people feel it in like, or I feel it in my extremities, passion flower can be really helpful for like easing that tension and stress and helping us sleep during fire season. And you want to be cautious with toxic varieties. There's a lot of medicinal, there's like a lot in that you can access of passion flower, but there's also a lot of toxic varieties. So the ones that you buy at the nursery aren't necessarily the ones that you can work with for medicine. So you just want to look it up before you plant. And then, okay, great. We're actually doing great on time.
Question?
Yes.
As far as like non-toxic and toxic passiflora, like,
Yeah.
I guess looking it up, you would find like specific species that are recommended or not.
Yeah, I think the most common one is passiflora incarnata. And that's like the most common one in commerce that you see, but there's also like where I live on the West Coast, there's passiflora caurulea, which is a different species that's grown at like some smaller herb farms, like the Sonoma County Herb Exchange grows that one. That's the one that I purchased to make tincture with. And I know that there's different species on the East Coast outside of those two, but I would consult, like I would consult an herb farm or herb farmers or herbalists out there before just picking one at the nursery, because there are some that can be toxic, and they might not have that information at the nursery, if that makes sense. But there's a lot more. I mean, passiflora is up and down the Americas. Like there's so many different kinds. Like in Nicaragua, we have one that's medicinal. I'm forgetting the botanical name now, but we call passiflora catapansa there. And catapansa is medicinal. But yeah, and there's like ones that are grown for the fruit, for maracuya, and there's ones that are like grown for the medicine, and there's one that are grown just like for garden varietal. So it's just you want to be mindful about asking in your bioregion and finding people that have that information to share. Yeah. Oh, I'm so relieved that we're doing good on time. Okay, so the last thing I want to share before I open to questions, and maybe we can do that journaling prompt, is respiratory steams, because this is really helpful in the acute. And they're really, really, really easy to do. So let's talk about how to do them, and I'll talk about some of the plants. Like there's the elderflower. I think that was supposed to go on the other one. They're really easy. You basically just get a bowl and you do like 3 pinches of herbs in your bowl, and you want hot water to pour into your bowl, and then you drape your entire, you want to make sure you create like a tent over yourself. You want to make sure that you're covered, like your shoulders, your head, and you want to position yourself over the bowl. And you want to be careful in the beginning, you don't want to burn yourself. So you kind of like test the water as you go, but you just kind of sit in this little tented respiratory steam for anywhere between like 3 minutes and 30 minutes. I recommend having a box of tissues or toilet paper or a napkin or something, because like you want to be in there and have like things come out of you. You want to cry, you want mucus to come out. Like you want to make sure that you're really cleansing And depending on the plants that you're working with, you can really, what's so great about respiratory steams is that you're getting the medicine in the steam to directly touch the mucous membranes. Like you're inhaling them all the way into your lungs, and they're touching all of the mucous membranes as they go through. So it's different than like a tea that's like, that's also somewhat touching, but then getting in your bloodstream and then like distributing that with your body. With the respiratory team, it's like directly, you're getting direct touch between that medicine and your mucous membranes. And so some to think about are like culinary, like aromatics. Culinary aromatics are really great for clogged sinuses or bringing up any inflammation in the sinus cavity. So like thyme or rosemary or any of the mints, spearmint, peppermint, any of the mints are really great in respiratory steams. You can work with some of the plants we've talked about already, like yerba santa is really great for like drying any of like that mucus that can get that over proliferates in the body. You can work with elderflowers, that's in the photo here, for like upper respiratory inflammation. You can work with nervines in a steam, like putting a little chamomile or a little rose in there can be really nice as well. And you can steam like 2 to 3 times a day during active fire season. It's really wonderful. Like if you're done steaming, you can like pour the that plant and the water onto a como se dice, onto the a pot on the stove and like leave that simmering. You just want to keep an eye on the water level so you don't burn your pot if all the water evaporates. But like you can steam your room. You can do like home steams with any of these plants we're talking about today. The one thing I'll say is I don't recommend steaming with essential oils. I know that they're really accessible and popular. But essential oils, I mean, there's so many reasons that they're dangerous. Like they take an abundance of plant to make. They have a really intense impact on plant world. They're like pharmaceutical strong. You can burn your mucous membranes with certain essential oils. They're really harsh for young children and animal companions. So like using them in vaporizers or atomiters or whatever they're called, like they're actually super intensely harmful. They're really intense in the body. They make the liver work really hard to filter some of those particles. So whenever possible, whole plant medicine is a much less impactful or less harmful way of receiving some of the medicine that you can work with. Let's see, any lingering before I move to questions? One other plant I didn't mention so far that I find really helpful during acute fire season or acute trauma in general is anemone, also called pulsatilla, also called or pulsatilla, also called Western pasque flower. This is a low dose plant, meaning that they're very toxic and higher than like a few drops. But as a low dose plant, you can work with the flower essence, which is much more sustainable for the plant than working with tincture, because you don't necessarily need to harvest this plant to make the medicine. The flower essence is just as strong. But this is a really nice plant for disassociation or PTSD. So if that is a part of your picture of fire season, I like, for example, I've had not so much lately, but when growing up, I had chronic panic attacks. And this is one of the only plants that has been supportive in drawing me back into my body and making that feel safe. So this is one of my biggest allies. And again, you only need like 1 to 3 drops of the flower essence or the tincture, if you happen to have access to it, of this plant in order to support disassociation or post-traumatic stress disorder, or any of the kind of more of the panic responses that our body makes during triggers or during trauma. Yeah, I feel like I just talked about a lot of plants. Does anyone have any questions, or do you need any clarity around how any of the information that I expressed, or kind of like the distinction between preventative and acute care? As you organize your thoughts, like one thing I find helpful in preparing for this class, but in general for fire season, is like really taking that space and time to create those plans and lists for yourself. So like, rather, I think it can be overwhelming sometimes to hear a lot of different plants. It can be like, all of those plants would benefit me, I need all of them. But really taking time to identify what are the areas that you feel weakest in, or what are the areas that the people that you're supporting and feel weakest in, and finding plants that have overlap. So like, if it's liver or indigestion and some emotional support needed, you can work with vervain. That's one plant that is accessing 2 of those body systems, so that you're minimizing. It's kind of like less is more. I think dominant culture and big businesses like more is more, like formulas with like 8 plants, but really you only need like a handful, like a few, like 2, 3, 4, so finding identifying what it is that you're hoping to do preventatively, and what it is that you're hoping to have prepared for acutely beforehand is helpful in kind of minimizing any overwhelm and deciding like how to support yourselves and your family, if that makes any sense. And trying as much as possible it's kind of like why I mentioned that endangered plant piece, is trying not to respond from a sense of urgency, which is really just a product of capitalism, like trying to respond from a place of like abundance and resilience. So like part of that is time, and that's super anti-capitalist, is creating time for ourselves, so creating time to make those plans and connect with those plants bioregionally, or sustainable ways to help support. And if you walk away with any plant today, I hope that it's mullein, because mullein is so abundant and so ready to share, and is really such a joy, and can be worked with in so many different ways. Oh, the one thing about mullein though, and then I'll stop talking. The one thing about mullein is if you've ever touched mullein, they're like really fuzzy and soft. They have these little fine hairs. And so when making tea with mullein, you want to be really careful about how you strain, because you don't want those fine hairs to get into your tea. They can be really irritating to the throat. So I like to use like a coffee filter to strain any tea that has mullein in, like a paper coffee filter, or I have this French press that has a really fine mesh strainer that's dedicated just to tea, and that's what I use to strain. Okay, I'm done talking. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. First, I just want to thank you for all this experience and knowledge that you shared with us today. And especially one of the things that touched me was just remembering smoke carries our prayers to Creator and the spirits, and to remember, and during times of great mega fires, smoke is smoke, and we can do that now. And many other things that you shared with us today. But I just had, and this is a big question, and maybe, there's isn't really time to even discuss it, but one of the other things that I really appreciate you talking about is remembering the, regeneration. Even with the mega fires, there will be regeneration. But in this case, here there's concern that our ponderosa forests and, our high altitude forests will not come back because of the conditions of warming won't allow them to come back. And so I'm just curious if you have experience or if anybody does with building relationships with the invasives, which are very likely to come in to these thousands and thousands of acres and, change life ways, change our animals' life ways and so many other things. And, some of the beautiful people I work with are talking about how we need to, really make friends with the invasives and learn their medicine as well. And so I was just wondering if anybody has any reflections on building relationships with these new worlds that are coming with these mega fires and so many other circumstances with the environment.
Thank you. I love this question so much. It's something I've thought a lot about, and I think before I respond, does anyone else have a response or thoughts or anything they'd like to share? Or you can also use the chat. Yeah, so I'll share a little, and then please feel free to hop in if you have thoughts. I so appreciate this question. It's something that I've thought a lot about because when I first started practicing herbalism, I was really oriented towards working with just native plants to my bioregion or native plants to my ancestral lands. And over time, that's really shifted. Both because my relationship to ideas of purity has shifted, but also because because of the drought, because of the climate crisis and the ways that it's impacted the native plant population. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about, what's considered invasive versus native. And I don't know that I have any one answer for that, but I do like to think about the ways in which plants as people have different personalities. So not all invasive plants behave the same way, and not all native plants behave the same way. Some have more tendencies to take space from other plants, and some can grow more harmoniously. Some have different actions that they offer, or have different behaviors that they offer to the soil, different gifts that they're offering versus other. It is such a big topic. A couple of things that come to mind is on the Herbal Highway, which I don't even think I mentioned. I'm one of the hosts of the Herbal Highway, which is this radio show and podcast that has been around for 25 years. We're celebrating 25 years this year. And it's such a profound honor that I've been invited to host on that show. But we did a 3-part series, I want to say last year. It was me and Sarah Holmes and Emiliana Lemus did one about invasive plants. I don't remember what we titled it, and maybe I can send it along to Urban Gura afterwards. But we talked about those different relationships and how what that can teach us, what plant relationships can teach us humans about our patterns of colonization or our patterns of taking up space. So anyway, it's a long way of saying that I think it's a really nuanced conversation, but definitely one that, gosh, there's so much grief in it to hear about the ponderosa pines in your community. And there's also, it sounds like in the way that you posed your question, so much respect and space for how the so-called invasive plants that are coming through, like what they can offer and how we can be in better relationship with them, and what they can teach us about how to be in a better relationship with ourselves. So it's a long way of saying I don't know that I have any of those answers, but I'm grateful for the inquiry and to take space to kind of consider what that means in my bioregion. Right, because it's interesting, like the way that climate crisis is happening, we are starting to get to points where there's no coming, there's more severe consequences than there has been. And in that there is so much grief. Yeah, one last thing I'll add is, so I used to be pretty, like I said, I used to be pretty like invasive plants are like colonizers, and like that was kind of like my worldview. And not that I disliked them, I was just like, that's how I understood the way that they behaved. And then I had a friend, her name's Mila, who's also an herbalist up north, and she kind of reframed it for me in a way where she was like, no one is illegal, like no being is ever illegal. And I'd never literally thought about invasive plants in that way. Like for me, it's easy to do that with people, but I'd never thought about plants in that way. And it completely overturned my understanding of my orientation towards, so-called invasives, and even towards colonization or towards whiteness. So I don't know if that offers any food for thought for you as well, but it was really helpful for me to hear because I'd never thought of it like that. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything they want to add? Thank you, Kathy. As we close, I would love to do a short 1 or 2 minute closing just to release the intention that we said at the beginning and just hold space for any of the emotions that have come through in talking about this crisis and how we can support ourselves through it. Yeah. So make yourself comfortable once more. Feel free to turn off your screen if that feels best. Close or lower your eyes and tune into your breath once more. But this time as you breathe, imagine that your breath is coming in and out through your heart. And with every inhalation, you're breathing in any hope that you feel in our collectivity, any hope that you feel in the medicine of the plants, any hope that you feel in sharing space for our grief, our sense of loss. And with your exhale, invite yourself to release anything that's ready to be let go. Release any fear that's ready to be released. Release any anxiety or tension that's ready to be softened. And as you continue to heart breathe, I invite you to recall the intention that you set at the beginning of the session. And working within the rhythm of your own breath, see if you can release that too. Like a spell being cast or a prayer being said. See if you can release that intention out into the world so that it may come true. When you're ready, follow the sound of your heart, the beating of your heart back into your body and into your heart once more. And from this space, from this heart breath, open or raise your eyes when you're ready. Thank you so much for your time today, for joining me on a sacred Sunday. Thank you, Sebastian, for hosting us and for your time and the gentle way you hold space. I would love if you could share resources, shorts in different groups. Yes, I will send that along to, is that okay, Sebastian, if I send you some resources to share? Great, yeah, I would love to share. I have a little list I've compiled with my herb school. I'll make a note.
Yeah, we'll send that out with the recording link.
Beautiful.
If it's ready on time. Otherwise, just whenever you have it ready.
Thanks for that spaciousness.
Totally.
Please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions about, I know there was a lot of information shared. I like to be thorough and sometimes it's a lot. So if you have questions or ideas or more comments, please feel free to reach out. You can email me directly. Yeah, such an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot of words, but I'm also speechless in a way. Yeah. Not feeling a rush, going into that, making time, feel the spaciousness from everything that we just lived together. Yeah, I'm very grateful for. Yeah, I'm in no rush to leave myself. If anyone, I'm not sure if you need to get going, Renee. I just want to acknowledge the time as far as what the clock says.
Yeah,
I'm open to hearing from other people as well.
Me too. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you with my voice. So to you, Sebastian, also. well. And thank you. I will carry this forward with so much respect and gratitude. Thank you. Bye for now.
For now.
Oh, I forgot to stop the recording. I'll do that now.